let's take a look at Language Matters, Essays and Arguments, which is our 10th grade Reading and Writing Across Multiple Texts unit. You'll see that this shows up as Unit 4 in our progression and that it lines up with the other multiple texts units at other grade levels. And like those units, this unit takes several texts from a variety of authors and sort of puts them in conversation with one another and allows students a chance to think about some of the big ideas that join those texts together. Now, in this case, we will be reading the works of Martina Espada, Richard Rodriguez, and Chang-Rae Lee in this unit. And the structure of this unit is what you'll see on the screen here. You'll see each of those texts across the top and some of these numbers, and I'll talk through a little bit of this progression briefly, and then we'll open up the unit itself. The unit begins with The New Bathroom Policy at English High School by Martina Espada. And like you're probably familiar with by now, we begin with a reading of the text and some comprehension work, having students go back through to craft a retelling of Espada's essay, moving through the comprehension, sort of showing that they get literally what's going on in it, so that we can then spend time digging into Espada's arguments. Students read his work closely and develop an understanding of what he is saying about bilingualism in his work, and they explain his position and analyze the evidence he uses to support his perspective on it. Following that, students read an excerpt from Richard Rodriguez's Hunger of Memory. And once again, they read through, they're marking important and confusing moments, doing some comprehension work with it. And then they are explaining how Rodriguez deals with this issue of public and private language. So Richard Rodriguez is writing from this personal space of his own memoirs and exploring this conflict that he went through. And so students analyze that and explain it in their writing, and then work through a few quick writes where they're unpacking the arguments that Rodriguez is making sort of below the surface of this writing. Now, you see the third text up at the top, but we're actually going to detour into that second row below this work here where you see the number 5. At this point, students process these first two texts together and they sort of put them in conversation with each other. Students are given the task to imagine that Espada and Rodriguez are participants in an argument about bilingualism. Their goal is to clarify in their writing what would Espada's position be on this topic and what would Rodriguez's position be on this topic. There are places where there might be overlap and places where there are going to be contrasts and differences between the two authors. Then we go up and we get this opportunity to expand and stretch our thinking by adding a third voice into the conversation. And students read Mute in an English-Only World by Chang-Rae Lee. And once again, we take some time to make sure we're understanding the text, and then students examine the issues that Lee introduces in his writing about the topic and what his arguments are as well. And just like task number 5 asked us to put Espada and Rodriguez in conversation with one another, task 7 here has us putting Lee into that room as well, saying if Espada and Rodriguez are taking two different positions in this argument, where do you think Lee would fall? Would he be on one of those sides in particular? Would he be somewhere between them for any particular reason? How would you place his position and why? The work then wraps up with a task that allows students to draw on all of the thinking and the writing work that they've done and write a 2 to 3 page essay in which they define bilingualism. And we're not just talking about dictionary definition here. We're talking about what is it in the context of these conversations here. They're going to summarize Espada's and Rodriguez's arguments. And for that, they can, of course, draw on some of the work they've already written. And they're going to construct an argument of their own in which they take a particular position and talk about where they stand in this debate. And for that, they are free to draw on the different methodologies of the writers they've read, including Chang-Rae Lee. So let's take a quick look at the guide. There won't necessarily be a lot more to talk through, having already gone through the overall shape of the unit. But we always open up and take a look at the introduction And one of the things it's always good to look at is a planning ahead, where there are some recommendations about just places you'll want to think about in advance. In this case, some of these sessions right after session 20 involve sharing some of your own writing as a model. So you'll want to look ahead at some of the tasks there and see how you might prepare for that. Quickly clicking through a few of the sessions themselves, we can pause briefly and look at the tasks as they're written. So in session 1, we're introducing Espada, the biographical sketch, as always. And then in session 2, students begin doing the retelling work, which is divided here into rereading and marking work, going back and summarizing chunks, and then combining those summaries into an overall retelling. All of which prepares students to begin digging into Espada's arguments further. And so with this task, they are writing a more developed paper where they're examining Espada's definition of bilingualism, referring back to his writing, of course. And so they're looking at what his arguments are, what evidence he uses. And this ties into the work they will do shortly with Richard Rodriguez. I will pause here for a moment just to note this is a good place to refer to the form guide from the Fluency Form and Correctness guides. You can open that up and look at the Writing to Inform and Explain section and pull some of the modeling exercises or using student work as an example from 1A and 1B of that guide. This is just some additional writing instruction you might choose to do based on what you're seeing in students' writing. So there are always these additional resources you can draw from as students are drafting their writing. And similarly, when students have submitted a piece of writing or have created a draft, you might have them refer to other resources. So you can pull in some peer review and revision exercises. You might turn to the targeted writing lessons in the digital toolkit, or some of these other pieces of work. With Rodriguez, they are explaining the difference between private and public language in his writing, which allows them kind of an inroad into his thinking and his arguments, and then creates an opportunity for the comparison work, looking at Rodriguez's arguments, connecting them back to bilingualism, and then later in session 12, comparing the two writers together. Session 13 does mention a few different ways students might organize their thinking as they're preparing to write about this. One option that isn't listed here in the manual, but I just want to bring up here, is a Venn diagram. Sometimes you cannot beat the simplicity of a good Venn diagram when you are just comparing two people or sets of ideas. When students have gone through the work for Espada, Rodriguez, and Chiang-Rae Lee, they're given the final essay task. And in this one, the parts are described here in the middle, like I was talking through just a moment ago, where they set out a definition of bilingualism based on these texts, examine both writers' arguments, and explore their own thinking about the topic. What I always appreciate about these units is the opportunity for students to study one another's writing in the same way that they have studied the work of the other writers in the unit. So in this case, in session 27, students are exchanging their work with one another, and they are reading with the same questions in mind. How does this writer define bilingualism? What are their arguments about it? And how does this writer support their claims? And that is the final session of the unit, with a little opportunity for students to reflect at the end. That is our Language Matters unit. So as you go into the planning work, we always make some of these following recommendations. Of course, you want to find your teacher manual and your student reader. You want to read through those texts in the reader in advance so that you know what your students are going to run into. In some of these topics, you just want to be ready for the conversations, and you want to be sure that you've established any important norms around discussion and conversation in your classroom. And then as you go to unit, look back through the introduction, skim through the at a glance for the sense of flow of the unit, look at the tasks and exactly what they're asking students to do so that you have those in mind as students are preparing for that work, and you can help clue them into what's coming up with that. It's an interesting and compelling unit about the language that we use and the way language works in society. I hope you and your students enjoy it as much as I have seen in so many classrooms.